Hey everyone, this is an introduction, or the introduction, by Baruch Knei-Paz, Baruch Knei-Paz's book, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. First, I'm going to read these explanatory notes, which is like a page long, before I start reading the introduction. So, let's boogie. Explanatory notes. Throughout this study, the term Russian Revolution, when thus capitalized, designates specifically and is used interchangeably with the Bolshevik October Revolution of 1917 or the October Revolution. The February Revolution is always identified as such, i.e. by its month. The fact that according to the Western calendar, the February Revolution took place in March and the October Revolution in November, has been ignored from the point of view of the nomenclature here followed. In this connection, it may be amusing to quote Trotsky himself on the problem of dates, noting that in his History of the Russian Revolution, the book, Trotsky, quote, felt obliged, end quote, to follow the old Russian calendar. He added in the preface to this work, quote, the reader will be kind enough to remember that before overthrowing the Byzantine calendar, the revolution had to overthrow the institutions that clung to the Byzantine calendar, end quote. Trotsky. However, in the few instances in the present work where specific dates are given, both the old Russian and its Western equivalent have been indicated. 2. Unless otherwise indicated, translations from Trotsky's works are my own. In a number of cases, however, I have consulted and exploited, to the point of actual citation, existing translations, while nevertheless giving reference to the original Russian only, since modifications of the translation were generally necessary. The translation so used has been indicated as a rule as at the first mention of the work concerned, but not thereafter, and in the section of the bibliography listing Trotsky's writings. 3. In the transliteration of Russian names and titles of works, I have followed common usage for the former, and contrived the most approximate but least cumbersome phonetic rendition of the latter. 4. Unless otherwise indicated, all italics and quotations are from the original. Alright, so here we are, introduction. Introduction by way of prologue. Quote, since the greatest enigma is the fact that a backward country was the first to place the proletariat in power, it behooves us to seek the solution of that enigma in the peculiarities of that backward country, that is, in that backward country's differences from other countries, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. All the epigraphs which appear at the heads of chapters are quotations from Trotsky's writings. In the above case, the source is The History of the Russian Revolution. End footnote. To the text. No student of Marxism or of Russian history needs to be reminded that the spectacle of a revolution proclaiming itself to be socialist in character and goals and triumphing in the Russia of 1917 raises the most fundamental problems of historical analysis and interpretation. In fact, more than half a century after the event, the Russian Revolution is still somewhat of an enigma and certainly a source of unending debate for the historian and for the student of political ideas alike. To grasp the dimensions of this enigma, one need only recall that at the beginning of 1917, the Tsar still ruled in the belief that he was divinely ordained to do so, that, at this same time, while the Russian intelligentsia lived with, quote, its head in the ... 20th century, end quote, its, quote, feet, end quote, were, quote, in the 17th, end quote, mired in a primitive agricultural economy, in a vast peasant population, culturally and socially impoverished, that the middle classes were economically and politically either insignificant or ineffective, and that hardly a single, quote, bourgeois, end quote, institution has successfully penetrated the monolithic power of the autocracy and the autocracy's hangers-on. Footnote. Hugh Seton Watson, The Decline of Imperial Russia, 1855 to 1914, New York, 1952, end footnote. Why, the poet W.H. Auden once wondered, did, quote, old Russia suddenly mature into a proletarian state, end quote. When in Rome, not when in Rome. I like saying when in Rome when it's not applicable. Never mind, I was going to read W.H. Auden's intro biography, but it's not particularly relevant here and it's kind of long. So I'm not going to do that. Anyway, back to the text. Let us suspend judgment as to whether the result of the mutation was, in fact, a, quote, proletarian state, end quote, or merely a pretense to a proletarian state. Even if the latter... Let me repeat this whole paragraph. I'm getting flustered here. Take a deep breath, buddy. Why, the poet W.H. Auden once wondered, did, quote, old Russia suddenly mutate into a proletarian state, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Lionel Kochan, Russia in Revolution, 1970. Let us suspend judgment as to whether the rest of the mutation was in fact a, quote, proletarian state, end quote, or merely a pretense to one, even if the latter. Auden's question fairly summarizes the enigma and pithily contraposes its essential incongruities. Why was it, indeed, that a society so backward economically and politically, so much on the periphery of Europe and only vaguely and superficially, through military aspirations on the one hand and intellectual ones on the other, a part of it, so apparently immune to Western developments both in the realm of social change and institutional innovation? Why was it that this society was the scene of the first, quote, proletarian, end quote, revolution, a revolution until then considered as compatible, if at all, only with the conditions prevailing in the advanced societies of the West? To pose this question is, of course, to raise the standard historical, quote, problem, end quote, of the Russian Revolution, and thereby what may by now be a somewhat commonplace issue, for it is a problem about which not a little has already been written, and to which manifold answers have been suggested. Footnote. It would be hardly possible to list all the works or even a selection of these dealing with this subject. Some of them, however, will be referred to in the course of this study. Arthur E. Adams, The Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Victory, Causes and Processes, published in 1972, contains a fairly representative sample of various views. End footnote. Yet it retains its power as a source of intellectual fascination, and in any case no one interested in the history of the Russian Marxist movement or in Russian Marxist thought can avoid seeing it as emerging at every stage of his inquiries and constituting in one way or another their overriding theme. The problem, after all, was anticipated long before the revolution, and it may be said to have been the source of almost every major theoretical and political controversy and rupture, of which there was not a few in the Russian social democratic movement. In particular, however, the problem of the relationship between backwardness and a socialist revolution occupied a central place in the thought of one Russian Marxist who is the subject of the present study and who, it will be argued, proposed the most original and in some ways the most convincing theoretical analysis, if not resolution, of its apparent contradictions. Leon Trotsky's analysis, moreover, had wider implications for social theory in general and for the theory of revolution in particular. However, the untenable propositions and assumptions which it also contained threw much light, ironically, on the subsequent fate of the Russian Revolution. History, of course, is not merely a record of ideas or theories, and an investigation of these certainly does not make other approaches to historical issues superfluous. In the present case, however, the playing out of ideas and theories reflects almost uncannily the course of reality itself, specifically between the logic and the incongruity of the actual meeting between a Marxist revolution and the, quote, old Russia, end quote. Our subject, therefore, is a chapter, and a general one at that, both in the history of Marxist thought in general, considered as a product of Western social and intellectual developments, and in the history of Russian Marxism in particular, considered as belonging, in part at least, to a very different environment. From the final decade or so of the 19th century, these histories overlapped insofar as the former was a model for the latter, but they also, and at an early stage, branched out in divergent directions. even while the model retains some of its influence. Thus, the subject of our study must be examined in both historical contexts simultaneously, with a view to understanding the manner in which it remained within the tradition of Western Marxism, and the point at which it contributed towards the creation of a considerably different tradition, though, in some ways which will become apparent in the course of the exposition, it may also be seen as unique in either context. Footnote. Western Marxism, of course, also contains a number of disparate traditions, but for our present purposes of distinguishing it from the Russian tradition, or rather from one main current of the latter, it may be considered as one whole, as having, that is, sufficiently common features marking it off from its Russian counterpart. End footnote. To state all this is not to prejudge the issue of whether a connecting line may be drawn, and along what points, between the thought of Marx and that of Trotsky, and or other Russian Marxists, and from there to the character of the Russian Revolution itself. It's merely to stress the by now well-known fact that Marxist thought was open to, or at least not obviously incompatible with, being variously assimilated. To put the matter in a different but familiar way, the social and political thought of one Russian Marxist is here analyzed, often explicitly but always tacitly, as an attempt to utilize, and thereby to develop in ways not always foreseen, a body of Western social thought in its political doctrine, for the understanding of the peculiar conditions and problems of Russian society at the outset of the 20th century and during the subsequent 4 decades. Today we have become accustomed to seeing Marxism as a doctrine with apparently greatest relevance and appeal to non-Western or quote, underdeveloped end quote, societies. But looking at the thought of Leon Trotsky, we may be able to better comprehend why this should be so. In any case, the somewhat popular view that Trotsky's thought was entirely within the European Marxist tradition will be shown to be a misleading simplification. Trotsky, perhaps more than any other Marxist, was responsible for transforming the geographical orientation of Marxist political theory in the 20th century, though this has not been generally recognized. It may be objected that the adaptation of Marxism to Russian conditions was, in fact, a goal pursued by all Russian Marxists, from Plekhanov onwards, and by none more so than by Lenin, and that, therefore, Trotsky was hardly unique in this respect. However, it is the view of the present author that in the case of Plekhanov, and most other Russian Marxists as well, no actual adaptation was carried out. Their theory of a Russian revolution consisted, on the whole, of a mere projection of Marxist theory of Western historical development into Russia's future. Whatever the merits of such an approach, it cannot be said to have constituted a theoretical innovation. Footnote. This is not to say, of course, that Plekhanov or others did not contribute works of merit and significance to Marxist theory in general. Trotsky himself always acknowledged Plekhanov's theoretical brilliance. End footnote. Now where the hell is the footnote? Come on. Okay. Marxist thought, in their hands, remained largely intact, or to use the standard term, it retained what was considered to be its, quote, orthodox, end quote, character, and this in spite of the fact that Marx himself, and Engels as well, had left the door open to the possibility that developments in Russia would follow a course very different from that of Western history, and might therefore issue in a revolution equally different from any experienced in Europe. Footnote. The views of Marx and Engels on backwardness in general and on Russia in particular are discussed in the appendix, which appears at the end of this study and which may be read by way of background to the issues here alluded to and subsequently raised throughout the study. End footnote. In the case of Lenin, the matter is admittedly somewhat more complicated and less obvious at first glance, but Lenin's failure to adapt Marxist theory to Russia becomes just as apparent when one recognizes that it was a Marxist political movement which Lenin in effect sought to accommodate to Russian conditions. Put another way, Lenin was not so much interested in the theoretical relevance of Marxism, nor in the theory as such of a socialist revolution, as in the manner in which a revolutionary movement, which happened to be governed by the Marxist ideology, should be organized in order that it might succeed in carrying out a revolution within the framework of the specific conditions prevailing in Russia. Footnote. It seems legitimate to use the term, quote, Marxist ideology, end quote, in the context of Lenin's approach to Marxist theory. It was Lenin, more than anyone else, who transformed the latter into an instrument for, primarily, political mobilization, whether of the masses or of the revolutionary elite. In this connection, see the study by Martin Seliger, Ideology and Politics, London, 1976, and footnote. It is almost impossible to overestimate the impact of what subsequently came to be known as Leninism or Bolshevism upon revolutionary movements and activities everywhere. But this virtually nothing to do with the social theory itself of Marxism, to which Lenin added little and which he merely harnessed to his own theory of the Revolutionary Party. Footnote. Once again, this is not to prejudge the connection between Marxist thought and the character of the Bolshevik Revolution or the operational practical conclusions derived by Lenin, nor is there any intention to imply that Lenin was not committed to Marxism or that from a personal point of view it did not form the foundation of his social and political beliefs. End footnote. The present study, therefore, takes as its point of departure the view that Trotsky's theory of a Russian Revolution constituted the only sustained attempt to explain the manner in which both Marxism and a socialist revolution were immediately related to the Russia of the early 20th century. This theory was formulated largely before 1917, and following the events of that year, Trotsky did not hesitate to claim that it had been confirmed by those events. Does it, therefore, provide an unraveling to the enigma of the Russian Revolution as Trotsky intended it to do? The analysis and critique of Trotsky's theory, from this point of view, makes up the main body of this study, and we shall not anticipate at this stage the ways in which, as has already been noted, the theory in fact did as much to unwittingly clarify the untenable elements in the juxtaposition of backwardness and the socialist aspirations or possibilities as to explain the tenable ones. One aspect of this question, however, needs to be mentioned here, since it runs like a leitmotif through all that follows. As against Trotsky's approach to the interpretation of the Russian Revolution, there's a very different school of thought which, however, also believes that the revolution presents no enigma. This is the school, occupying a prominent place in Western scholarship, which holds that the events of October 1917 and thereafter are simply and adequately explained by looking upon the Bolshevik seizure of power as merely a wild gamble that paid off. According to this view, political daring, determination, and decisiveness, not to mention the pure chance of circumstances, were the factors which sealed the future of Russia, and the triumph of the Marxist movement had therefore nothing to do with socialism or the logic of history or Marxism itself. One need not accept the extreme formulation of this view to the effect that all other factors are irrelevant. In order to agree that but for the person of Lenin and the party, the methods and the mentality Lenin almost single-handedly forged, we would not today be discussing the significance of a socialist revolution in Russia. As we shall see, Trotsky himself attributed to Lenin a crucial historical role, to the extent of admitting that without Lenin's leadership, October 1917 would not have taken place. Yet the whole of his theory of a Russian Revolution was founded on the proposition that history is not fortuitous or arbitrary. The relationship between chance and design, between individual choice or initiative and historical necessity, is a problem often encountered in Marxist theory. One of the aims of the present study, consequently, is to examine the persistent tension in the thought of Trotsky between the personal and the social, the subjective and the objective. We shall attempt to show why, after a long initial reluctance, Trotsky found it necessary in the end to see Russian Marxism as dependent on Bolshevism, and what the implications of this were for theory and practice alike. But this too was related to the problem of the backwardness of Russia, and it may help to resolve the enigma of the Russian Revolution. I missed a footnote. For an extreme example of this school of an extreme example of this school of thought, see Robert V. Daniels, Red October, New York, 1967. Daniels even argues that it was not so much Lenin's initiative or decisiveness which carried the day as his being forced to act, out of fear that if he did not gamble, then Kerensky's impending offensive against the Bolsheviks would effectively decimate the party. Alright, so that's the end of the introduction. Thanks for listening.